A maid, a mafia boss. A night of terror unlike any Chicago had ever seen. She was nameless in his world, just a silent shadow wiping away the blood after massacres she was never allowed to witness. But when his fiancée disappeared just hours before the blood feast, where all of America's biggest criminal organizations converged, Chicago's coldest boss chose her. A trembling maid, to stand beside a king. Tonight's story will show you that the invisible, sometimes, is the most dangerous person in the room. Like to support the channel. Comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because tonight, everything will fall apart. The blood never fully came out of marble. Serafina Vale had learned that in her first week at the Belladonna estate, kneeling on the cold floor of the East Corridor with a brush that had seen too many mornings like this one. The trick, she'd been told by the head housekeeper, a woman who communicated exclusively in clipped syllables and averted eyes, was to work fast before it dried into the grain, before it became permanent, before it became part of the house itself. She worked fast now, always. The brush moved in tight circles. Her knuckles were raw. The water in the bucket beside her had gone from pale pink to something darker, something she didn't name because naming things at the Belladonna estate was how you got yourself into trouble. The corridor was empty except for her and the sound of rain against the tall, narrow windows. A cold November rain that had been hammering Chicago for 3 days straight, the kind that seeped through wool and settled in the bones. Serafina was 26 years old, and she had the eyes of someone considerably older. She didn't look up when the footsteps passed. Heavy footsteps, 2 sets, guards doing rotation. She recognized the rhythm of them, the way you recognize the cadence of a language you've been surrounded by long enough. She kept her head down, her shoulders curved inward, her whole body arranged in the posture of someone who was not worth noticing. It had taken her 8 months to perfect that posture. She wore it like armor. The footsteps passed without slowing. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The Belladonna estate sat on 3 acres of manicured grounds in the Gold Coast, surrounded by iron fencing and the kind of security that didn't advertise itself. From the outside, it looked like what it was supposed to look like. The private residence of Lucien Moretti, one of Chicago's most prominent philanthropists, a man whose name appeared regularly in the society columns alongside his donations to children's hospitals and arts foundations. His photograph ran in magazines. He smiled in all of them, which Serafina found remarkable because she had never once seen him smile in person. Inside the estate, the truth was arranged differently. She had seen things in 8 months that she would spend the rest of her life trying not to see. Men being dragged through the service entrance at odd hours. Conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. Faces she recognized from a single encounter who were never seen again. She had learned to process none of it. To see without seeing. To hear without hearing. The women who had worked here longer, the ones who hadn't left or been made to leave, operated the same way. There was a particular emptiness in their expressions that Serafina recognized as a survival mechanism, not weakness. She had grown up in the foster system. She understood survival mechanisms. By the time she had wrung out the brush and emptied the bucket in the service sink, the corridor floor was clean enough. Not perfect, but the kind of clean that would pass inspection in dim light, which was how most things at the Belladonna estate were meant to be examined. She dried her hands on her uniform. Dark gray, mid-length, the kind of clothing designed to make the wearer disappear against the architecture, and picked up her supply caddy. The clock in the hall read 6:47 p.m. The Crimson Ball started at 9 p.m. The East Wing had been in controlled chaos since morning. Extra staff had been brought in, unfamiliar faces she'd been told not to engage with, and the rooms along the main corridor had been swept 3 times for what the head of security, a flat-eyed man named Voss, called irregularities. Serafina didn't know exactly what that meant, and understood that not knowing was preferable. What she did know, because the estate had a way of letting information seep through its walls like cold air through old plaster, was that the Crimson Ball was not a charitable gala. It was the annual consolidation. Once a year, the significant powers in American organized crime, the families, the cartels, the syndicates, gathered under Moretti roof in the guise of a luxury fundraising event and conducted business that could not be conducted anywhere else. Allegiances were confirmed. Grievances were addressed. Territory was negotiated over glasses of wine that cost more than Serafina made in a month. It happened every November. It had happened, she'd been told, for 19 years running. This year, something was different. She felt it the way you feel pressure changes before a storm, in the back of the throat, behind the eyes. The staff was moving too fast. Voss had doubled his security rotations, and his jaw was doing that thing where the muscle in his cheek ticked visibly. The florist who'd been arranging centerpieces in the ballroom had been removed midway through the morning without explanation. Even Mrs. Kane, the head housekeeper, had the look of a woman walking a very thin wire over a very long drop. Serafina kept her head down and finished her corridor assignment. She was pushing her supply caddy toward the service elevator when she heard the voice. Low, controlled, the kind of control that required active effort to maintain. What do you mean she's gone? Not a question. The inflection was flat, which made it worse. She didn't stop walking. She reduced her speed by the smallest fraction, enough to catch the words that followed through the gap in the study door, and kept her eyes ahead. Confirmed 30 minutes ago. Her personal vehicle is gone. Her phone is turned off. Her security detail. A pause that had weight to it. Did I ask about her security detail? Mr. Moretti, Find her. 2 words. The temperature in the corridor dropped. Serafina pushed through the service door and let it close behind her and stood in the narrow utility hallway for a moment, breathing. Lucien Moretti's fiancé was missing. She told herself this was not her problem. She told herself this with the same discipline she used to see without seeing and hear without hearing, the same muscle memory she'd built across years of situations where becoming involved in other people's catastrophes had consequences she couldn't afford. She picked up her caddy and went to finish the West Hall. By 7:30, the estate had shifted into the particular kind of silence that precedes very loud things. The extra staff had been positioned. The cars were lined up in the front circular drive, black, each one. Voss moved through the downstairs rooms with a Bluetooth piece in his ear and the expression of a man who had not slept in 36 hours and was operating on something colder than coffee. Serafina was collecting soiled linens from the guest suites on the 3rd floor when she dropped the tray. It happened because the latch on the service door was faulty. She had put in a maintenance request twice, which had twice been ignored, and the door swung open faster than she anticipated, catching the edge of the tray she was balancing. Crystal water glasses and a silver tray hit the marble floor of the 3rd floor landing in a series of sounds that were, in that particular silence, catastrophic. She was on her knees immediately, gathering shards with careful hands, cursing herself in the private language of someone who had learned that making noise was a liability. Leave it. She looked up. Lucien Moretti was standing in the doorway of the corridor that led to the private suites. He was dressed for the evening. Black suit, no tie yet, the collar of his shirt open by one button. He was 41 years old and built like a man who had never once in his life been allowed to be soft. Not tall enough to be imposing by height alone, but carrying himself in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples. His face was the kind of face that photographers liked. Severe, symmetrical, the bones doing the work. His eyes were a shade of gray that Serafina had privately compared in her internal catalog of things she would never say aloud to dirty ice. She had been in the same room as him perhaps a dozen times in 8 months. He had never looked at her directly. He was looking at her now. I said, leave it! His voice was the same voice she'd heard through the study door, level, the kind of level that took practice. She straightened slowly, leaving the shards on the floor, and stood with her hands at her sides. Her pulse was doing something she didn't appreciate. I apologize for the noise, Mr. Moretti. I'll have maintenance. What's your name? It wasn't a warm-up question. It landed like a hand on a desk. Serafina Vale. He looked at her for a moment in the way that she imagined he looked at everything, assessing, cataloging, arriving at a conclusion before the other person knew they were being read. How long have you worked here? 8 months. Where before this? A hotel? Downtown. Which hotel? She told him. He didn't react, which meant either that the information was irrelevant or that he already knew it, and she had a feeling it was the latter. You were in the corridor outside the study at 6:52, he said. Her stomach went cold. I was finishing my hall assignment, she said. Yes. He studied her. How much did you hear? This was the kind of question that didn't have a safe answer. She understood that. The wrong answer, either direction, had consequences she could map from here. She held his gaze because looking away felt more dangerous than maintaining it. Enough to know that tonight is more complicated than it was this morning. Something in his expression shifted. Not much. A fraction. That's a careful answer. I try to be careful. People who work in this house try to be careful, he said. Most of them manage it. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. Where are you supposed to be in the next 2 hours? I have linen rotation until 8, then the kitchen staging. That's been reassigned. He said it like it had already been decided, which it had, because he was a man for whom decisions happened before he announced them. Come with me. Mr. Moretti, don't ask questions yet. He turned and walked back down the corridor, and she stood there for exactly one breath before she understood that standing there was not an option, and followed him. The room he took her to was one she hadn't been in before. A dressing suite adjacent to the private study, fitted with a long mirror and a wardrobe that took up an entire wall. A woman was already there, someone Serafina didn't recognize, carrying the efficient energy of a professional who had been called in on short notice and had stopped asking why. 40 minutes, Lucian said to the woman and left. The woman, who introduced herself as simply Clara and offered nothing further, looked Serafina over with the rapid appraisal of a person whose job was calibrating human beings for visibility. Arms out, she said. I don't understand what's happening, Serafina said. That makes 2 of us. Clara was already moving along the wardrobe. But I have 40 minutes and you look like a size 4, so let's not waste the first 5 arguing. The dress was midnight black. Not the muted functional black of her uniform, but something else entirely. Fabric that caught light differently depending on how she moved. A silhouette that had been constructed with intent. It fit with the kind of precision that Serafina associated with clothes that cost more than she had ever had in her life at any one time. Clara did something with her hair and her face that she couldn't fully track, working quickly and without commentary except for the occasional directional instruction. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't quite recognize herself. That felt appropriate. Lucian returned at the 40-minute mark exactly. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor, assessing. Then he crossed the room and held out his arm. We're leaving in 10 minutes. She didn't take his arm yet. You need to tell me what I'm walking into. He looked at her. I'm not asking about your business, she said. I don't want to know about your business. But if I'm going into a room with people who are going to have opinions about what I'm doing there, I need to understand the outline. Otherwise, I'm a liability to you. She paused. I assume being a liability to you is not something I want to be. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my fiancée was supposed to attend this evening. She's not attending. No. And arriving without a companion would suggest weakness, instability. Yes. He said it with the flatness of a man stating a structural fact about a building. The people who will be in that room spend their careers reading those signals. One crack in the facade becomes leverage. So you need someone to stand beside you. For the evening, she thought about this. She thought about it in the 3 seconds she had before the calculus would be visible on her face, and she ran through the variables with the speed she had developed across years of situations where the wrong decision had immediate physical consequences. She was not naive. She understood the risk gradient of what he was describing. She also understood the risk gradient of refusing a request from Lucian Moretti in the Belladonna estate 40 minutes before the Crimson Ball. She took his arm. The Moretti Grand Hotel occupied a full city block in the near north side, a limestone monolith that had been built in the 1920s by Lucian's grandfather and renovated twice since, once in the 70s, once 5 years ago, after Lucian took full control. The second renovation had been significant. The bones of the place were still the original architecture, heavy and ornate, but the interior had been stripped and rebuilt to a standard that operated as its own kind of statement. Everything in this room was chosen deliberately, including who was allowed to be in it. The motorcade pulled into the private entrance at 9:17. Serafina had spent the 18-minute drive in the back of the car beside Lucian not speaking, which suited them both. She had used the time to control her breathing, to examine the interior of the vehicle with the peripheral observation she'd spent years refining, and to run through everything she knew, which was limited, about what she was about to walk into. She was a woman who had grown up in 12 different foster homes between the ages of 6 and 17. She had learned, in most of them, how to read the temperature of a room the moment she entered it, how to identify who held power and how they used it, how to locate the exits. She had learned this because it mattered in those rooms, because the consequences of misreading were concrete and immediate. She thought, those skills don't stop mattering just because the room is more expensive. The car door opened. Cold air hit her, carrying the smell of rain and the exhaust of idling vehicles, and something underneath, something that might have been expensive cologne or might have been fear. Lucien stepped out first. Then he extended his hand back. She took it, stepped onto the wet pavement, felt the weight of the moment, the camera's position near the entrance, the suited men flanking the door, the brief but complete attention that shifted toward them like a physical thing. She lifted her chin. The ballroom had been built to make people feel small. It was 3 stories high, fitted with chandeliers that dropped from the ceiling like geometric constellations, each one a cascade of crystal that threw fragmented light across the room in patterns that shifted as people moved through them. The walls were paneled in dark wood and ivory plaster, and the floor was a polished expanse of black and white marble that reflected everything above it. The guests were extraordinary, not in the civilian sense. The people filling the Moretti Grand Hotel's ballroom were extraordinary in the way that certain predators are extraordinary, dressed impeccably, composed completely, moving through the room with the kind of ease that comes from decades of inhabiting spaces where violence was always one bad decision away. They were, by the standards of the legitimate world, invisible. No wanted posters. Mostly no criminal records. Several with civic positions, charitable foundations, legitimate business portfolios that employed thousands of people. The moment Lucien walked in with Serafina on his arm, the room noticed. It happened in waves. First the people nearest the entrance, then spreading outward as the information traveled. Not through any obvious communication, but through the subtle electromagnetic field of social intelligence that these people had developed as a professional necessity. Serafina felt it move across the room like a weather system. She kept her face neutral. She kept her shoulders back. She breathed. "Moretti?" A man materialized at Lucien's left, heavy-set, early 60s, wearing a tuxedo that strained slightly at the shoulders, with the kind of handshake grip that was itself a sentence. "I didn't know you'd be bringing a companion." "I decided last minute," Lucien said. The ease in his voice was extraordinary to witness up close. "You know how these evenings are, Roland." The man called Roland turned his gaze to Serafina. It was the gaze of a man taking inventory. "And who is the lovely—" "Serafina," she said, before Lucien could introduce her. She extended her hand to Roland, which was a calibrated choice, offering it before he could decide whether to offer his, establishing direction. "I've heard a great deal about you." She hadn't. She didn't know who he was. But his eyes narrowed slightly in the way eyes narrow when someone has said something that could be a compliment or a threat, and she understood that she'd hit the right register. Roland shook her hand. "All good things, I hope." "Most of them," she said. Lucien touched the small of her back briefly, a pressure that lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated something she wasn't entirely sure she could name, and steered them deeper into the room. "Roland Finch," he said quietly, close to her ear. "Kansas City." She filed it away. The first hour was managed performance. She stood beside Lucien through a series of introductions and conversations that operated entirely in 2 registers simultaneously, the surface conversation and the subterranean one happening in body language, positioning, and the things that weren't said. She tracked both because she found she could, because this particular skill set turned out to transfer across social contexts more cleanly than she would have predicted. She said little. When she spoke, she made it count. What she primarily did was watch. She watched the women more than the men, because the women were often more informative. The wives and companions of the men in this room were not decorative. They were operational, present because they were useful, maintaining relationships and gathering information in the spaces where the men couldn't go without it being significant. They moved through the room with a practiced ease that Serafina recognized as professional competence, not unlike her own. One of them found her deliberately. She appeared at Serafina's elbow during a moment when Lucien was briefly occupied, A woman in her 50s, silver-haired, wearing deep red, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make stillness into a weapon. Her name, she offered, was Valentina Russo. Her husband was the man across the room who was speaking with Lucien. "I haven't seen you before," Valentina said. It was almost conversational. "I haven't been before," Serafina said. "Lucien doesn't usually—" She paused, selecting the word improvise. "I think this year he made an exception." Valentina studied her with the directness of someone who had decided that social niceties were for people who had something to gain from them. "Where are you from?" "Chicago," Serafina said. "South Side, originally." Something moved behind Valentina's eyes. Serafina couldn't quite read it, but she filed it away with the rest. "Interesting," Valentina said, finally, in the tone of a word that meant more than itself. She moved away without further comment. It was approaching 10:30 when Serafina heard the conversation that mattered. She had been near the side corridor, Tatan, not by design exactly, but because she had been moving away from an exchange that was becoming repetitive and had arrived at the far edge of the room where the noise level dropped enough to make individual words discernible. The corridor off the ballroom's east wall led to the private dining suites, and through the partially open door, two men stood close together with the posture of men who did not want to be overheard. She didn't stop. She found a reason to exist near the wall, a passing server carrying empty glasses, which she gestured toward as though expecting a replacement, and stayed in her orbit. The words she caught were fragments, but fragments were enough. "By midnight," he confirmed. "And the ledgers?" "Handled." Once Lucien's... The door shifted, and she was already moving. She thought about what she had heard for the next 40 minutes. She thought about the word ledgers. She thought about the phrase, "by midnight." She thought about the way one of the men had positioned himself, partially blocking the other's line of sight to the room, which was not an instinctive move. That was a trained move. At 11:15, she found Lucien in a break in his conversation cycle and touched his arm once. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "There are two men who have been meeting privately in the East Corridor. I caught part of their conversation. The word midnight came up, and something about ledgers, and your name." Lucien's expression didn't change. "Which two men?" "I don't know their names. One of them is tall, gray suit, has a scar along his left jaw. The other is shorter, wearing a watch that," she paused, "is ostentatiously wrong for this room." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he said, and it was not warm. It was the acknowledgement of data received. And he moved away to speak to Voss. Serafina picked up a glass of mineral water from a passing tray and stood in the shifting light of the chandeliers and breathed and waited. She didn't have long to wait. 20 minutes later, a commotion developed at the edge of the room. Not loud, not theatrical, but the kind of quiet, urgent regrouping that she recognized as an emergency being managed at low volume. Men converging around Voss. Voss's face doing nothing, which meant something was wrong. She crossed the room. She didn't push through, just moved steadily until she was close enough to hear Voss say, in a voice stripped of inflection, "It's Carver, East Suite." And then, because the name Carver meant nothing to her but the way Lucien's face went when he heard it meant everything, she understood that something had already started. Lucien looked across the room and found her eyes with a precision that suggested he'd known exactly where she was. The look he gave her lasted less than a second. It said, "This is no longer the evening I described in the car." And beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by the most dangerous people in America, Serafina felt the floor of the situation drop away. Because Marco Carver, Lucien's most trusted captain, had been found in the East Suite with a single bullet hole behind his left ear, and the crimson ball had just become something else entirely, and she was standing in the middle of it in a dress that wasn't hers, with no way out that didn't go through the room. The East Suite smelled like gunpowder and expensive carpet, and something beneath both of those things that Serafina's nervous system recognized before her brain caught up. She wasn't supposed to be in the corridor outside the room. She understood that. The corridor had been sealed within 4 minutes of the discovery, Voss's people moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had managed crises in expensive hotels before, and the guests in the ballroom were being held in a kind of managed suspension, conversations continuing at slightly higher volumes than before, the way people talked when they were performing normalcy over a substrate of fear. She was in the corridor because Lucienne hadn't told her not to be. That was the whole of her authorization, and she knew it was thin, but she had spent her life navigating on thin authorization, and she stood against the wall 12 feet from the suite's door and watched. Voss came out first, then two of his men, carrying the particular blank expression of people processing information they weren't going to process until later, in private, in whatever passed for quiet in their lives. Lucien was last. He pulled the suite door closed behind him with a care that was itself a kind of violence, the deliberate, controlled movement of a man keeping himself on the correct side of the line between function and something else. He stood in the corridor. He didn't look at anything in particular for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Serafina. "You should go back to the ballroom," he said. "You told me to stay close." "I'm revising that instruction." "Is that a good idea right now?" she said. "Revising things?" His jaw worked once. Voss looked at her with the expression of a man who had opinions about her presence and had decided this was not the moment to voice them. "Mr. Moretti," Voss said. "Give me a minute, Voss." Voss gave him a minute, which meant he moved 8 feet down the corridor and stood with his back to them, which was its own kind of professional courtesy. Lucienne crossed to her. Not quickly. The walk of a man who had decided on a speed and was maintaining it through effort. He stopped close enough that she could see the precise quality of his stillness, the way it wasn't natural, the way it was constructed, the way something underneath it was moving fast. "Marco Carver has worked for me for 11 years, he said. Low. For her alone. She didn't say anything. She understood this wasn't an opening for response. "He was the man who told me about the conversation you overheard." He looked at her. "He was in that East Suite inside of 6 minutes, single shot. Suppressed, or the ballroom would have heard it. Professional." A pause. "Meaning someone in that room has a professional with them tonight, which is not supposed to happen. The Crimson Ball has rules. Weapons? Yes. Hired shooters? No. Someone came prepared to break the rules," she said. "Yes. Which means they came prepared for the possibility that the rules wouldn't hold them." He looked at her for a moment in the assessing way. "You're quick." "I've had to be." He stepped back from her. "The ballroom cannot know about Carver. Not yet. If they know, the event collapses, and the collapse itself becomes information. Information about how I handle crises, information about what I can and cannot contain." He straightened the cuff of his jacket with 2 precise adjustments. "I need 20 minutes to confirm what I'm dealing with. You will go back into that ballroom. You will be visible. You will be calm. And if someone asks where you are, tell them I stepped out to make a call." He moved toward Voss. "And Serafina." She looked at him. "Stay away from the East Corridor, Samtet." The ballroom had metabolized something in the 20 minutes she'd been gone. She felt it the moment she came back through the main doors. A subtle shift in the room's electrical charge. The way conversations had redistributed themselves. The clusters had tightened. People who had been circulating freely were now anchored to their factions, the invisible lines between groups having become slightly more visible. Not obvious to anyone who wasn't watching carefully. Obvious to her. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray because it gave her hands something to do and moved into the room with the deliberate ease of someone who had nowhere to be. Valentina Russo found her again within 4 minutes. "Lucienne's been gone a while," she said, arriving at Serafina's shoulder with the smooth inevitability of a woman who had been tracking her since she re-entered the room. "He had a call," Serafina said, "at this hour, during the ball. Business doesn't schedule itself around events." She looked at Valentina directly. "I'm sure your husband understands that." Valentina was quiet for a beat. "My husband is wondering," she said, "as are several others, why security has been reinforced in the East Wing." "I wouldn't know about that." "You've been at his side all evening." "I've been at his side at parties before," Serafina said. "Not at his elbow during security briefings." It was a lie structured around a true thing, which was the most durable kind of lie. Valentina processed it. Her expression didn't change substantially, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. "You're careful," she said finally. "I try to be." That's an interesting quality in a woman who walked into this room without a history. Serafina let the silence run for exactly the right duration. Everyone in this room walked in without a history, she said. That's rather the point of the guest list. Valentina's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same coordinates. She withdrew, and Serafina held the champagne glass she hadn't drunk from and breathed and continued watching the room. The man with the scarred jaw was at the bar. She'd placed him the moment she came in, the tall one from the East Corridor conversation, the one whose fragment of speech she'd caught before the door shifted. He was drinking something amber, standing alone, and his eyes were doing a slow and regular sweep of the room that was too regular to be casual. She recognized that sweep. She'd watched enough of Voss's people do it tonight to know what it looked like when it was professional and what it looked like when it was amateur. This man was professional, but he was also watching the main doors with a frequency that the other security sweeps weren't. He was waiting for something, or for a specific absence. She looked away from him and looked instead at the room's east-facing wall, where the doors to the corridor had been unobtrusively sealed. A velvet rope, a posted guard in event dress, who could pass for hotel staff if you weren't paying attention. Paying attention was her current occupation. The shorter man, the one with the wrong watch, was gone. She did a full casual survey of the room, the kind that started with the bar and moved clockwise at social speed, pausing for brief eye contact with acquaintances she didn't have, and confirmed it. The shorter man had been near the windows when she returned to the ballroom. He wasn't there now. She set down her untouched champagne glass and made her way toward the south corridor, the one that led to the event's ancillary rooms, coat check, guest facilities, a small library that had been opened for the evening as an overflow space for quieter conversations. The library was wood-paneled and low-lit, 4 or 5 people inhabiting the leather chairs with the posture of men who conducted important conversations in the guise of casual ones. She moved through it toward the far end, where a secondary door led out into the hotel's back corridor system. She nearly ran into the man coming the other way, the shorter man. Wrong watch. Up close, he was perhaps 50, with a face that had been lived in hard, the kind of weathering that came from specific climates and specific choices. His eyes did the rapid calculation of a man deciding something in real time. She said, before he could speak, "Do you know where the ladies' room is? I've been turned around. A beat." He looked at her the way you look at a problem you're not sure is actually a problem. "Back through the main ballroom," he said, "left at the fountain." "Thank you so much." She smiled in the way she'd seen the other women in this room smile, the controlled warmth of a woman who had learned exactly how much of herself to offer in social transactions. "Terrible how big these places are." He moved past her. She counted to 12 before she turned around. He went straight to the library's secondary door, opened it, checked the back corridor, and went through. She waited 20 seconds and followed. The back corridor was service infrastructure, wide enough for equipment carts, lit by fluorescent panels that hummed at a frequency that sat behind the ears. It ran parallel to the ballroom's east wall. She stayed close to the wall and moved quickly and quietly, the dress an unexpected advantage because the fabric didn't rustle the way she'd feared. The shorter man was 30 feet ahead, moving with purpose. He stopped at a door marked Private, Hotel Management, and knocked twice, paused, knocked once. The door opened from inside. She pulled back around a utility alcove and pressed herself flat and breathed through her nose. The door was open for 40 seconds. She caught nothing of the conversation from this distance, only the low frequency of voices, too indistinct to read. Then the door closed and the shorter man came back her way. She had approximately 4 seconds. She turned and walked away from him at a pace that was purposeful but not rushing, the walk of someone heading somewhere specific, not away from something. She counted her own footsteps. 8 steps. 10. She reached the turn in the corridor and went around it. She held very still and listened to his footsteps past the turn without slowing. She let out a breath that had no business being that shaky, given that she'd done nothing technically wrong. She stood in the side corridor and put her back against the wall, and thought about what she'd just done, and what she was going to do with the information, which was essentially nothing, because she had no information. She had a knock pattern, a room, and a man she couldn't identify doing something she couldn't specify. She had an instinct that had kept her alive for 26 years and was currently telling her that the East Suite and the sealed corridor and the wrong watch and that room were connected, and that connected to whatever was supposed to happen by midnight, and that all of it was inside this hotel and moving towards something. She went back to find Lucien. She found Voss first. He was in the main corridor outside the ballroom, speaking into his earpiece with the clipped abbreviation of someone relaying coordinates. He saw her coming, and his expression did the thing it had been doing all evening, which was communicate that she was a variable he hadn't been given parameters for and therefore had opinions about. "Where is he?" she said. "Mr. Moretti is... I need to speak with him." "This isn't..." "There's a room in the back service corridor, management access, approximately 40 feet east of the library exit," she said. "Someone is using it tonight who isn't management. The man with the scar on his jaw is in the ballroom conducting surveillance sweeps. The shorter man with the Patek Philippe, the one that's 20 years too old for how he's dressed, has been in and out of that room twice in the last half hour." Voss looked at her. His expression did not change in any identifiable way, but something behind it shifted. "You're confident," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference. Where is Lucien?" He was in a room off the hotel manager's suite, a small, functional room that had been converted for the evening into an operational space, a folding table with a laptop and 2 phones and 3 men she didn't know standing with the posture of men receiving information they didn't like. Lucien was at the far end of the table. He looked up when she came in. "The room in the back corridor," she said without preamble. "Someone's running an operation out of it." The 3 men she didn't know looked at her. One of them started to say something, and Lucien raised one hand, which was enough. "Tell me exactly," he said. She told him exactly. The knock pattern, the timing, the shorter man's movements, the scarred man's position in the ballroom. She was precise and quick, and she did not editorialize, because this was not the moment for editorializing. When she finished, Lucien was quiet for 3 seconds. "Santos," he said to one of the men. "Take 2 and go check the management room." Quietly. Santos. A man in his late 30s, compact, with the face of someone who made rapid professional decisions, nodded and left with the other 2. Lucien looked at her. "How did you know to follow him?" "The watch was wrong," she said. "Men in this room who wear old money, watches actually have old money. His hands didn't match the watch. His shoes didn't match the watch. He borrowed the aesthetic and missed the details. And you know what old money looks like?" "I know what the absence of it looks like," she said. Same information, different angle. Something crossed his face that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite respect, or rather, not just respect. Something more complicated, the expression of a man who has been handed something unexpected and is deciding what to do with it. He pulled out a chair from the folding table, which was the closest thing to an invitation she was going to get, and she sat down. The room smelled like old carpet and nervous energy. "Tell me something," she said. She kept her voice even. "Carver. Was he loyal?" Lucien's eyes moved to her. "For 11 years. People change in 11 years." "Yes," he said. It was flat. "They do." "Was there anything in the last few months?" "I don't discuss internal business with..." He stopped. "With the help," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking because I'm curious," she said. "I'm asking because someone in that ballroom brought a shooter and used them on the man you trusted most in the building, and then closed the door on the conversation, and then stationed a spotter, and then occupied a room in your hotel's service corridor. That's a coordinated operation. Coordinated operations have internal access. You need to know where it came from." The silence that followed had texture. "6 months ago," he said finally. Low. The voice of a man accessing something he didn't want to access. "Carver made a trip to Miami that wasn't on his schedule." "Did you ask him about it?" "He said it was personal." "Did you believe him?" Another pause. Longer. "I chose to." She heard the weight of that. The precise, specific weight of a decision that had seemed manageable when it was made and was now something else. "Okay," she said. "That's it? Okay? I can't do anything with your regret," she said. "I need to know if there's anyone else you've extended that kind of trust to recently." His jaw went tight. "You're asking me to audit my own people. I'm asking you to do it right now, in the next 5 minutes, before Santos comes back and whatever is in that room becomes your immediate problem. He stared at her for a long moment. The quality of the stare was different from the earlier ones, less assessment, more something she didn't have a clean word for. Then he said slowly, "My cousin has been asking about the Crimson Ball for 3 months. Logistics, guest list, security rotation." She kept her face neutral. "Your cousin?" "Dante. He's 34. He runs our West Side operations." A pause. "He's always believed he should run more." She was quiet. "He's family," Lucien said. And it came out not as a defense, but as a diagnosis, the acknowledgement of a blind spot that had been there long enough to become structural. The door opened. Santos came back. His face was tight. "The room's empty," he said. "But there's a briefcase. Left behind." He set it on the table. "We didn't open it." Lucien looked at the briefcase. Then he looked at Serafina. Then he opened it. Inside were printed documents. Financial ledgers she could see from her angle. Dense columns of figures with account numbers and dates. A USB drive. And a single printed photograph. He picked up the photograph. His face, in the moment he looked at it, went through something that she watched the way you watch something you know you're not supposed to see and can't look away from. It wasn't long, a second, maybe 2, before the control came back down like a shutter. He set the photograph face down on the table. "Get out," he said to Santos. To the empty room. His voice had changed register. Santos left without comment. She should have left too. She didn't. Lucien put both hands flat on the table and looked at the closed briefcase and breathed. She could see the breath, the deliberate expansion of his rib cage, the controlled release, the mechanics of a man keeping himself functional by main force. "The photograph," she said quietly. He picked it up and held it toward her without looking at it again. It was a surveillance image, taken at distance but clear enough. A parking garage, 2 men standing beside a car, the angle capturing both their faces. One was the shorter man. Wrong watch. The other was Dante Moretti. The next 40 minutes moved differently. Lucien made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, all brief, all in a register she understood was operational language even without knowing the specifics. Santos came back in, listened to a set of instructions, left again. 2 other men she hadn't seen before came in, received the USB drive, left. The room became briefly busy and then empty again. She stayed in her chair. At some point, someone put a glass of water in front of her. She drank it. When the room was just the 2 of them again, Lucien stood at the window. A narrow window that looked onto the hotel's interior courtyard, rain still falling, lit from below by courtyard lighting that made the water look like static. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, and she could see the tension in his shoulders from across the room. The specific set of a man carrying something heavy and refusing to put it down. "Dante has been building this for at least a year," he said. Not to her specifically, to the window. The Miami trip, the interest in the ball's security rotation, the relationship with... He stopped. "The photograph is 3 months old." "He wanted to move at the ball," she said. "Maximum impact. Every significant family in one room. Kill the competition and frame me for it in a single night." He was quiet. "Clean. He was always good at thinking cleanly. He killed Carver. Carver must have found something, or was about to." His voice didn't waver. It was worse that it didn't waver. Or Dante wasn't sure and didn't want to risk it. She stood up from the chair. "What are you going to do?" He turned from the window. In the room's flat light, he looked like what he was. A man who had built an empire on the premise that he could control his environment and was standing inside the first moment where that premise had fully failed. He looked tired, not physically, the other kind. "I'm going to finish this evening," he said, "and then I'm going to handle this. Tonight, yes. With Dante in that ballroom." "Dante isn't in the ballroom," he said. "I checked. He arrived at 9:40 and left at 10:15, before Carver was found." She processed this. He's already gone. He accomplished what he needed to accomplish in here. Planted the evidence, confirmed Carver's neutralization. He said it without flinching, which was its own thing. The attack, if there is one, will come from outside. If there is one. The ledgers in that briefcase detail 3 years of payments to... He stopped. To people who don't come cheap. He hasn't bought them for a dinner party. She walked to the table and picked up the photograph. She looked at it. The shorter man's face, now that she knew what she was looking for, matched two of the other men she'd clocked in the ballroom. Same physical type, same professional sweep. She counted them in her memory. Not two. Three. There are three of them, she said. In the ballroom. I thought the tall man with the scar was working with the shorter one. But the pattern's wrong. The scar man has been stationary, sweeping. The other two have been moving. The scar man is the anchor point. Lucien went very still. He's the one with the communication line to outside, she said. The other two are mobile. They're mapping the room. Exits, positions, coverage gaps. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that she almost missed it. How many people in that ballroom are you willing to let die tonight? She looked at him. Because that's what we're talking about, he said. Not an attack on me. A massacre. Every person in that room is a target. Dante wants a body count that rewrites the whole board. He held her gaze. So I'll ask again. What are you willing to... The shot came from somewhere in the building. Not suppressed this time. And then the lights went out. And in the 3 seconds of total darkness before the emergency lighting kicked on red and low, Serafina heard the ballroom, 40 feet and one wall away, erupt into... The emergency lighting came on red, not the warm amber of candles or the cold white of overheads. Red, the specific red of systems designed to communicate danger without ambiguity, the color that bypasses the thinking brain and lands directly in the older, faster parts. The ballroom through the wall had gone from murmur to chaos in the span of 4 seconds, and Serafina was already moving before she'd consciously decided to move, the decision made somewhere below language in the part of her that had learned, across years of bad rooms and worse nights, that hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. Lucien was at the door ahead of her. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, and his face in the red light was something she hadn't seen on it before. Not panic, nothing as clean as panic, but the specific expression of a man whose calculations had just been invalidated and who was rebuilding from zero in real time. Stay behind me, he said. I'm not negotiating, he said. Stay behind me. She stayed behind him. The corridor outside the operations room was already populated. Voss coming fast from the north end with 2 men. Santos materializing from the south. Everyone moving with the compressed urgency of people who had trained for exactly this, and were now discovering that training and the thing itself occupied different rooms in the brain. Voss's earpiece was alive with noise she could hear from 3 feet away, fragmented voices overlapping. Report, Lucien said to Voss. Generator's been cut. Primary and secondary both. That's not accidental. Someone had the building plans. Voss was moving while he talked, keeping pace. Ballroom doors on the east side have been jammed from the outside. We've got guests trying to compress toward the west exits, which is exactly what... Hurting them, Lucien said. Yes, sir. The shot. Upper floor. We think the parking structure access on level 3. It took out the secondary generator housing. A pause from the earpiece. Voss listened. His face did not change, but his pace increased. We've got movement on the north stairwell, multiple. Lucien stopped walking. Everyone around him stopped. How many? He said. Thermals reading 8 to 12. Armed. Serafina did the math that she understood Lucien was also doing. 8 to 12 armed men entering from the north stairwell. Guests compressed toward the west exits. East doors jammed. It was a funnel. She'd seen funnels before in smaller contexts, in the geography of group homes where the older kids controlled the hallways, and the principle was the same regardless of scale. You controlled the exit, and you controlled everyone who needed to use it. They're going to hit the west lobby, she said. Lucien looked at her. That's where everyone is going to be in the next 3 minutes, she said. The west lobby is the kill zone. Voss looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing all evening, and then looked at Lucien, and something passed between them that was not verbal. West lobby, Lucien said to Santos. All available. Now. Santos moved. Lucien turned to Voss. Alternate exit for the principals. Service loading dock, sub-level 1, but the elevator's down with the power. Stairwell. North stairwell has the... South stairwell. Voss touched his earpiece. Listened. South is clear, for now. Then we move. He turned to Serafina. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully decode in the red light and the noise. You come with me. I'm not a principal, she said. You are tonight, he said. Move. The south stairwell was concrete and emergency lighting, and the sound of the building in distress. Somewhere above them, something had caught fire, or at least something was producing smoke, because the air in the stairwell had taken on the quality of air that had recently been near heat, a thin chemical sharpness that sat in the back of the throat. They went down, not up. Lucienne, Serafina, Voss, and two men she didn't have names for, moving fast, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the stairwell's echo. On sublevel 1, the door to the service corridor was heavy steel, the kind that required a key card that Voss had. He swiped it. The lock cycled. The door opened. The service corridor at sublevel 1 was wider than the one upstairs, built for freight, floored in industrial rubber, lit by strip lighting that was on a separate circuit from the main building system and was therefore functioning. It smelled like diesel and concrete, and the particular institutional smell of spaces that had never been intended for human comfort. At the far end, maybe 60 feet, a roll-up door that would open to the loading dock. They were 20 feet in when Voss stopped. He stopped because the man at the end of the corridor was not one of theirs. The man was standing at the roll-up door's control panel with his back to them, and he turned when he heard them, and he was holding a weapon that was not pointed at them yet, which meant they had approximately 1 second before the calculus changed. Voss's men were faster. It was over in 4 seconds. Not clean. Nothing at this scale was clean. But contained, and the man was on the floor, and disarmed, and Voss was crouched over him with the economy of motion of a man who had done this before. He's not one of Dante's regulars, Voss said. He looked up at Lucien. Federal contractor. I've seen this kit before. The word federal landed in the corridor like something physical. Serafina watched Lucien's face process it. Dante said he'd partnered with federal agents, she said quietly. It came out before she'd decided to say it. The memory of the fragment in the briefcase, the ledgers, the payments. The ledgers upstairs. You said the payments were to people who don't come cheap. Lucien was looking at the man on the floor. The man was conscious, looking back at him with the expression of someone who had decided not to speak. Professional. What agency? Lucien said to him. Nothing. I'm not going to ask a third time, Lucien said. His voice was at a register she hadn't heard from him yet. Low, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than loud. What agency? The man on the floor held his gaze and said nothing, and Lucien straightened up and looked at Voss and said, The loading dock is compromised. We need another route. There isn't another route from sublevel 1 that isn't on the building schematics. Then we go back up. The north stairwell. Ballroom level, Lucien said. Not above it. We go back into the building, not out of it. Voss did not visibly react, which was its own reaction. Sir? Dante's operation is designed to drive us out, Lucien said. The loading dock was the catch point. He knows how I think. A pause, and in that pause something moved across his face that was not quite fury and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He's been watching me think for 34 years. Going back up the south stairwell was a different experience than going down. Serafina's body knew it. The change in the quality of her breathing, the weight in her thighs that was partly exertion and partly the specific heaviness of moving toward danger rather than away from it. She counted steps the way she had learned to count things when she was young, in houses where counting gave the brain something to do besides panic. 14 steps per flight, 3 floors to the ballroom level, 42 steps. She made it to 41 before the door above them opened. 2 men came through it. Not Voss's, not Santos's. The next 12 seconds were loud and close, and she was behind Lucien's left shoulder, which was where he'd put her, and she pressed herself against the stairwell wall and made herself small and watched the space close and expand around the men who were handling it. It was not like the movies. It was faster and uglier. And when it was over, one of Voss's men was sitting on the stairs holding his forearm at a careful angle, and the 2 men from the doorway were no longer standing. Voss assessed his man's arm with 2 seconds of attention. Can you move? Yes, the man said, with the flatness of someone who had decided the answer was yes before he'd finished evaluating. Then move, Voss said, and they went through the door. The ballroom level was smoke and noise, and the specific visual chaos of expensive clothing and panic, the two things creating a combination that in other contexts would have been absurd. The west lobby, visible through the ballroom's main archway, had the compressed density of a crowd that had been funneled and stopped. Serafina could see Santos's people at the perimeter, holding a line. The dynamics of the situation suspended in the way dynamics suspended when people with weapons established control of a space. Nobody was shooting in the lobby. Not yet. The guests were recognizable as themselves, even in crisis. The particular quality of people who were accustomed to controlling their environments trying to manage a situation they could not control. She could see Valentina Russo near the west wall, standing very still in a way that was clearly active, clearly a choice, her eyes tracking the room with the calculation of a woman assessing options. Roland Finch was near the archway, his earlier bonhomie entirely absent, replaced by something older and colder and truer. Lucien moved through the space and people moved for him automatically, the party not born of fear exactly, but of something in how he moved, purposeful, present, with a quality of absolute certainty that read, in a crisis, as the most valuable thing in the room. He reached Santos. Status. We've got the lobby contained for now. The 8-man unit from the north stairwell has been redirected. 3 neutralized, the rest have pulled back to the floor above. Santos's voice was level. But we've got a problem. He handed Lucien a phone. On the screen was a text. Short. Serafina read it over Lucien's shoulder before she caught herself. And then she read it again because she needed to be sure she'd read it correctly. The text said, "You have 20 minutes before the feds breach the building. Everything inside gets bagged as evidence. Everyone inside gets questioned. I'd suggest using the time wisely. It was signed with a single letter. D." Lucien lowered the phone. His hand was steady. She was watching his hand, and it was completely steady, and she found that, in context, profoundly unsettling. "He's going to let the federal operation do what he couldn't," she said. Lucien didn't answer. He didn't need to. The calculation was visible. Dante's mercenaries had done enough. Enough to create chaos. Enough to compromise the building. Enough to kill the man who might have warned Lucien. Enough to plant evidence and scatter the ball's attendees into a law enforcement net that would spend the next year untangling the relationships inside this building tonight. Even if none of the principals were convicted, the exposure alone would be catastrophic. Relationships built on secrecy and managed distance would be public. Names would be attached to other names. The infrastructure of 20 years of carefully maintained power would be burned down by forensic accounting and federal subpoenas. Dante wouldn't need to fire another shot. "The ledgers," Serafina said. Lucien looked at her. "The briefcase in the operations room," she said. "Where is it now?" "Santos." "I left it," Santos said, flat. The admission of a man who had prioritized correctly and knew the cost. The operations room was on this floor, east side. She ran the layout in her head. She'd mapped it when they first went in. The way she mapped every room she entered. The east corridor was where the sealed door was, where Carver had been found. It was also where the men from the north stairwell had been heading before Santos's people redirected them. She understood in the same moment that Lucien understood it. "They're not redirected," she said. "They were redirected from the lobby. They went east instead." Santos's jaw tightened. "They went for the briefcase," Lucien said. He said it in the voice of a man watching a chess move complete that he'd failed to anticipate. "The ledgers name Dante's federal contacts. He needs them back before the breach. Or he needs to make sure they don't survive the breach," she said. Lucien turned to Voss. "How many do you have available right now?" 3. Effective 3. The north corridor to the operations room. "Sir, if Dante's men are already there, I need those ledgers." His voice had reached the quiet register again, the one that had nothing gentle in it. "Those ledgers are the only thing that proves federal corruption in this operation. Without them, every person who walks out of this building tonight walks into a clean federal case with no countermove." He looked at Serafina. She didn't know why he kept looking at her during the pivotal sentences. She had a theory that it was because she was the only person in his immediate vicinity who would look back without the specific kind of deference that told him only what he wanted to hear. "You know where the room is," he said. "Yes. I need you to take me there." "Voss knows where it is. Voss is going to keep this lobby from collapsing in the next 20 minutes. His eyes didn't leave hers. You were already in the East Corridor once tonight without being seen. You know the layout from the inside. She thought about what she was being asked. She ran the variables in the time she had available to run them, which was approximately 3 seconds, and came out the other side of the calculation with the answer she'd already known before she started. I know the layout, she said. Let's go. The East Corridor was darker than the rest of the floor. The emergency lighting thinner here, one of the strips having failed, leaving a gap of shadow between the functioning panels. She moved fast and low, Lucian behind her right shoulder, 2 of Voss's men behind him. The carpet swallowed their footsteps. The smoke smell was stronger here. The operations room door was open. She stopped 6 feet from it, put her hand back, a flat gesture she'd seen Voss use. Stop. Lucian stopped. The men behind him stopped. She listened. Inside the room, movement. Specific movement. The sound of a person handling physical objects with care but speed. The soft percussion of papers. The click of a hard case being opened. One person. She was fairly sure. The breathing pattern of the room was singular. She looked back at Lucian, held up one finger. He understood. He communicated it backward with a gesture she didn't see but heard the effect of. The men behind him repositioning. She moved to the doorframe. The man inside the room was at the folding table, and he was not one of the men she'd cataloged in the ballroom. He was younger, early 30s, dressed in the dark, tactical civilian clothing that read as anonymous in dim light. The briefcase was open in front of him. He was photographing the ledger pages with a phone, working fast, and he had not heard her because she had become, in this moment, the thing she had spent 8 months practicing being invisible. She looked at the briefcase, at the USB drive sitting beside it, outside the case. She looked at the distance between the door and the table, 11 feet, maybe 12. She looked at the man's weapon, holstered at his right hip. She stepped into the room. He heard her on the second step. The floor had a seam in the industrial rubber that she hadn't known about, and her heel caught the edge of it. And the sound was small, but in a quiet room it was enough. He started to turn, and she was already crossing the remaining distance, and the calculation she made was not a conscious calculation, but a physical one, made in the body, drawing on years of close-quarter navigation in spaces where she'd been the smaller person in the room and had learned that the smaller person in the room could not afford to hesitate. She reached the table before he completed the turn, grabbed the USB drive and the top 3 ledger pages with her left hand, and when he got his hand to his hip, she was already moving laterally, and Lucian came through the door, and the room compressed into sound and motion, and when it resolved, the man was on the floor, and Lucian was standing over him, and Serafina was at the far wall with the drive, and the pages pressed against her chest. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a clinical detachment that she recognized as the brain managing itself under load. She breathed through it. The shaking stopped. "Are you hurt?" Lucian said. "No." He crossed to her and took the ledger pages and looked at them, turning them quickly, reading with the speed of a man who knew what he was looking for. His expression, while he read, was something she watched without quite intending to. The succession of reactions that a face makes when it's processing information that confirms something it didn't want confirmed. He lowered the pages. "Dante has a direct channel to the federal task force that's been building a case against our family for 3 years, he said. He's been feeding them information, curated information, enough to build a case against me specifically, not the family. Me." He was quiet for a moment. "He's been constructing this since before our father died." She absorbed this. "The task force tonight, the breach, that's his doing. He told them I was planning an attack at the ball, gave them a timeline, gave them the building layout." His voice was entirely flat now. The flatness of something that had gone past the point where affect was useful. "The federal operation tonight isn't incidental to Dante's plan. It is Dante's plan. The mercenaries clear the field, the feds walk in, and I'm standing in a building full of dead bodies and terrified crime bosses, and every piece of evidence points at me." She thought about Valentina Russo at the west wall, still calculating. Roland Finch near the archway, watching. All of those people in the lobby, waiting. None of them knowing that the building they were in had been turned into a mechanism for their destruction by a man who was at this moment somewhere else, clean, untouchable. "You said he left at 10:15, she said. "Yes? He wouldn't leave without eyes in the building. Someone is still feeding him information." She looked at the man on the floor. Not him. He's too low level. Someone with access to the principals. Lucien said nothing. Who knew the layout of the operations room? She said. Who knew you were using it tonight? I set it up this afternoon. Hotel management, Voss, Santos. He stopped. She watched him stop. Santos, she said quietly. Lucien's face, in that moment, did something she didn't have a name for. The face of a man who has just understood that the second person he trusted in this building was not what he believed, and understanding it not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality with immediate consequences, because Santos was in the West Lobby right now, with every remaining principal and every remaining weapon, managing the situation that was about to be breached from the outside. Voss doesn't know, Lucien said. No. If I pull Santos out of position, the lobby collapses, she said. Yes. He looked at her. In the failing emergency light, with the smoke thickening and the sounds of the building in distress layering over each other, he looked like what he was. A man who had built his entire life on the premise that he could see his enemies clearly and had just discovered that the ones who could get closest were the ones who loved him, or had pretended to. The ledgers, she said. We need to get them out of the building before the breach. If the feds walk in and find them here, they become federal evidence and Dante's contacts get scrubbed, he said. Yes. He looked at the pages in his hand, the USB drive in hers. How long do we have? Dante said 20 minutes. That was... She tried to reconstruct the timeline. 12 minutes ago. Maybe 13. 7 minutes. He looked at the man on the floor, at the doorway, at her. I need you to take that drive out of the building, he said. She stared at him. I don't know this neighborhood. I don't know your contacts. I don't know. You don't need to know my contacts. He reached inside his jacket and produced a phone. Not the one she'd seen him use, a different one, a simple prepaid model. There is one number in this phone. You call it when you're clear of the building. You tell them you have the Carver material. They'll handle the rest. And the feds at the perimeter? The feds are coming through the north entry. Dante would have given them the principal access point, which means the loading dock is compromised and the north lobby is the breach point. He crossed back to the man on the floor, crouched, went through his pockets with rapid efficiency, produced a key card. Sub-level 2. Below where we were before. There's a maintenance tunnel that runs under the street to the parking structure on the next block. It's not on the public building plans. Is it on the plans Dante gave the feds? Lucien looked at her. You don't know, she said. No, he said. I don't know. She took the key card. She took the phone. She stood in the room with the USB drive and the weight of what she was being asked, and looked at Lucien Moretti in the red emergency light, and understood that 7 minutes ago she had been a person with a limited and manageable set of problems, and she was no longer that person, and there was no version of the next 7 minutes in which she became that person again. If I walk into federal agents in that tunnel, she said. You're a hotel employee who got lost during an evacuation, he said. You have no documentation connecting you to any of this. You were brought here tonight in a private car and you are not on any list. He held her gaze. You are the only person in this building they don't already have a file on. She thought about that, about the particular freedom and terror of being invisible, about how long she had spent cultivating exactly that, and how it had never before been an asset she could spend on something that mattered. Santos, she said, what are you going to do about Santos? I'm going to walk back into that lobby, he said, and look him in the eyes and give him nothing to read. The way he said it told her he'd already worked out how to do it. The mechanics of concealing knowledge from someone who was watching for signs of it. It told her something about how he'd gotten to be who he was. And then, I'm going to make sure those people get out of this building. And Dante. Dante is the next problem, he said. Not this one. She closed her hand around the key card. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd been avoiding looking. The way you avoided looking at things that complicated the straightforward business of surviving. He was looking back at her with the same quality of attention, and in it was something she recognized from the few times in her life she'd seen it. The look of a person who has stopped managing how they appear to someone and is simply, the tunnel smelled like groundwater and old concrete and the particular cold that lived underground in November. The kind of cold that had never once in its existence been warmed by a human body and had no intention of starting. Serafina moved through it with the key card in her left hand and the prepaid phone in her jacket pocket and the USB drive pressed between her palm and the key card, held there by the friction of her grip because she didn't have a better place for it and she was not going to drop it. The tunnel was lit by a single strip of utility lighting mounted low on the left wall, the kind of lighting designed for maintenance workers to find their footing, not for speed. She was moving at speed anyway. The ceiling was low enough that a tall person would have had to duck. And she was not tall, but the air had the quality of air that had been enclosed a long time, thin and tasted of iron, and she breathed through her mouth and kept moving. Behind her, the sublevel door had closed. Ahead of her, 60 feet of tunnel, and then whatever was at the other end. She counted her steps the way she had counted steps in the stairwell. It gave the brain something to do that wasn't imagining what was ahead. 20 steps. 30. The utility lighting flickered once, a single pulse of darkness that lasted less than a second, and her stride didn't break, but her heartbeat did, lurching and then catching itself, the involuntary response of a nervous system that had been running at high load for 4 hours and was beginning to accrue interest. At 40 steps, the tunnel curved slightly to the right. At 52 steps, she could see the far end. A door, steel like the one she'd come through, with a panel beside it that matched the key card reader she'd used on the sub-level 2 entrance. The door had a gap at the bottom, not large, 2 inches, and through it came a sliver of different air. Not outdoor air, not yet, but less enclosed than the tunnel, the air of a larger space. She stopped 4 feet from the door. She stood and listened with the quality of attention she'd been developing for 26 years, since the first group home where the sounds of the hallway outside her door had been meaningful information that she needed to be able to read correctly. Footsteps. Weight distribution. The difference between one person and two. She was not infallible at this, but she was better than most. Nothing from the other side of the door. She swiped the card. The lock cycled and she pushed through in one motion, keeping low, moving left along the wall of the new space before the door had finished its arc, putting her back to concrete before she took in what she was in. A parking structure. Sublevel, as Lucien had said. Concrete pillars and a grid, painted yellow at the bases. The low overhead of underground infrastructure. The lighting here was better than the tunnel. The structure's own emergency system on its separate circuit, throwing even fluorescent light across the empty bays. A dozen cars, at least, positioned in their marked spots, which meant this was a functioning structure and not abandoned, which meant there was an exit somewhere above her with a street-level attendant or an automated gate, or both. Which also meant that if Dante had provided the federal team with this exit point, they would have covered it from the street level, not down here, because the street level was where they would expect someone to emerge. She breathed once. She moved toward the ramp. The ramp was at the structure's north end, a wide concrete slope angled upward toward a gate she could see from 40 feet away. A standard parking gate, black and white striped bar, a booth beside it with a light on inside. Through the windowed upper section of the booth, she could see the edge of a figure. She stopped. The figure in the booth was not moving the way an overnight parking attendant moved. An overnight parking attendant, even awake, had a quality of settled waiting about them, the particular stillness of someone with no immediate obligation. This figure was upright, positioned facing the gate, with the posture of someone waiting for a specific event. She backed up. She went to the nearest car, a dark sedan, driver's side, and crouched behind the rear quarter panel and thought. Street level was covered. The tunnel behind her led back to a building that was about to be breached by a federal operation that would process every person in it. She had 7 minutes left from when Dante's text had been read, of which some unknown portion had been consumed by the tunnel and this structure. Call it 4 minutes. Maybe less. She had the USB drive. She had a phone with one number in it. She made the call. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, businesslike. No greeting. Yes? This is Serafina Vale, she said, keeping her voice at the volume of someone who was very aware of acoustics. I was told to call this number when I had the Carver material. A pause. Brief. Where are you? Sublevel parking structure. I believe it's the building north of the hotel. I came through a maintenance tunnel. She looked at the gate booth. The street exit is watched. I don't know by whom, federal or Dante's people. Both, the woman said, with the flatness of someone who had been monitoring this situation and was not surprised by any of it. Stay where you are. Do not attempt the street exit. Do you have the drive physically on you? Yes. Keep it. We're going to lose this call in approximately 40 seconds because you're about to have company in that structure from the south ramp. Stay low, stay quiet, and stay on the line. She processed this. South ramp. There's a second access point that was on the original building plans, the woman said. Dante's team doesn't have the updated survey. Stay down. She stayed down. She pressed herself against the rear panel of the sedan and made herself small, which was something she had practiced making look effortless, and which was, at this moment, not effortless at all, but was necessary. 12 seconds later, she heard it. The sound of the south ramp, a door, and then footsteps. 2 sets. Moving quickly. The woman on the phone said, "Look for the woman in the gray coat." She looked. Through the gap under the car's chassis, she could see feet, 2 pairs, moving along the south wall of the structure toward her position. 1 pair in gray tactical boots, 1 pair in dark dress shoes that were not built for operational situations and were managing anyway. She stood up from behind the car. The woman in the gray coat was 40, close-cut hair, with the economy of movement of someone who had done field work for a long time and had stopped needing to signal it. The man beside her was younger, wearing the expression of someone who had been briefed extensively and was now discovering that briefings and the thing itself were different. "Vale," the woman said, not a question. "Yes, Walsh." She extended one hand. In it was a credential wallet, flipped open, federal, but not the insignia Serafina would have expected. She read the relevant information in the 2 seconds she had to read it and handed it back. "You have the drive." She produced it. Walsh took it and passed it to the younger man, who had a case open and ready. Then she looked at Serafina with the assessing directness of someone who had been told a thing and was now evaluating the source. "Lucien Moretti told you to call this number." "Yes." "And you're his housekeeper," Serafina said. "Until tonight." Walsh's expression did not change in any discernible way, but something behind it did. "We need to move," she said. "The surface operation is going to breach in the next 6 minutes, and I want us clear of the structure before that happens." She looked at Serafina. "You're coming with us." It was not a question, and it was not a request. "I know," Serafina said. "Let's go." The south ramp led out into an alley 2 blocks east of the hotel. She came up from the underground into cold air and rain and the smell of the city, and for a moment the simple physical reality of being outside after hours of enclosed spaces was so overwhelming that she stopped walking and just stood in the rain and breathed one full breath before Walsh's hand on her shoulder moved her forward toward the vehicle at the alley's end. She didn't ask where they were going. She got in the car. Through the vehicle's rear window, as they pulled out of the alley, she watched the hotel's north facade. From this distance and angle, she could see the lights, the emergency vehicles beginning to congregate, the coordinated movement of a federal operation assembling at its entry points. She watched it for as long as the car's direction permitted, and then it was behind her and she was facing forward. She thought about the 47 people in the hotel's west lobby. She thought about Voss and his clipped coordination and Santos on the lobby floor. She thought about Lucien walking back into the ballroom to look Santos in the eyes and give him nothing to read, and the particular quality of that, the mechanics of concealing knowledge from someone who was watching for it. She thought, hold on. She said, "Where's Lucien?" Walsh looked at her from the front seat. "Moretti is—" "He went back to the ballroom," Serafina said. "He was going to manage Santos and get the principals out." She looked at Walsh. "Your operation is breaching in 6 minutes. He's still in the building. We know where Moretti is. Then you know he's about to be inside a federal breach with 47 people, including some of the most dangerous criminals in the country and one of his own lieutenants who has been feeding intelligence to your corrupt task force counterpart." She kept her voice flat, the way she'd heard Lucien keep his voice flat when he wanted something to land with weight rather than emotion. "Santos knows the breach is coming. He's going to use the chaos." A silence in the vehicle. "We're aware of Santos," Walsh said. "Are you aware that Santos knows your breach timeline because Dante fed it to him through the same channel he used to feed your task force colleagues?" Serafina said. "He's been inside Lucian's organization for at least a year. He knows your protocols because Dante's team reverse-engineered them from the task force communications." She held Walsh's gaze in the rearview mirror. "He's going to move before your people get in. In the chaos of the breach, it reads as crossfire. not targeted. The silence this time was different. Walsh produced her own phone, made a call she didn't explain, spoke in a clipped, abbreviated shorthand that Serafina could follow the shape of without catching all the content. She heard the word lobby and the word Santos and the word accelerate, and then Walsh ended the call and looked at the driver. Move. The vehicle moved. She sat in the back seat of a federal vehicle driven by a man who hadn't spoken and navigated streets she was learning from the window, and she did not ask again, because the asking had been sufficient and the action had been taken and the rest was not in her control. She had learned a long time ago that the line between what you could affect and what you couldn't was a real line, not a philosophical one, and that spending energy on the wrong side of it was how people broke. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and waited. 4 minutes later, Walsh's phone lit up with a text. Walsh read it. Something in her shoulder shifted. A release, small but visible, the body communicating what the face was not. Lobby is clear, Walsh said. Santos is in custody. A pause. Your employer is out of the building. Serafina closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, the city was going by outside the window, and she was in a car she hadn't chosen, going to a location she didn't know, and she had a USB drive that didn't belong to her anymore, and no jacket in November. Rain and the dress she was wearing had survived the evening in a condition that Clara was going to find professionally distressing, and she felt, threading through all of that, something that it took her a moment to identify because she wasn't accustomed to feeling it. Something that was almost relief. Almost. Walsh's vehicle stopped at a building on the river's edge. Not federal, private, the kind of nondescript mid-rise that served as legitimate commercial space for operations that preferred to be adjacent to, but not inside institutional infrastructure. Serafina got out of the car and stood on the wet pavement and looked at the building and at Walsh and said nothing. We need your account of tonight before the task force's version of events gets established, Walsh said. Everything you observed, everything you heard, everything you handled, in order, starting from your arrival at the hotel. I know, Serafina said. It's going to take time. I don't have other plans. Walsh studied her for a moment with the direct calibrating attention she'd used since the parking structure. You're not what I expected, she said. I'm not what most people expect, Serafina said. That's been useful. They went inside. The room they put her in was functional. A table, chairs, recording equipment that was not hidden but was not prominent. A window that looked onto a light well. A woman in her 30s brought her a paper cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since early evening, and she drank it anyway because the alternative was to continue running on depleted infrastructure, and she had more to do before she was done. Walsh came in with 2 people, the younger man from the parking structure, who turned out to be called Reyes, and a woman named Park, who had a laptop and the typing speed of someone who had transcribed many hours of testimony and had opinions about people who spoke unclearly. Walsh set a recorder on the table. Whenever you're ready, she said. Serafina put the paper cup down. She straightened in the chair. She thought about the beginning, the east corridor, the clock at 6:47, the brush moving in tight circles on marble that never fully came clean. She began. She was thorough and she was sequential, and she omitted nothing that was material and included nothing that wasn't. And she spoke in the same voice she'd used all evening, clear, even, without effect that would read as performance. Walsh listened without interrupting. Reyes took notes on paper. Park's fingers moved across the keyboard at the speed of thought. When she reached the moment in the stairwell, the door opening and the 2 men coming through, Walsh stopped her. You engage directly, Walsh said. Yes. You have training. I have history, Serafina said. It's not the same thing. What kind of history? She thought about how to answer this in a way that was accurate and not more than the question asked for. I grew up in situations where understanding how to protect yourself in close quarters was not optional, she said. I have never had formal training. I have had a great deal of practice with the specific mechanics of being a smaller person in a space with people who intend to harm me. She paused. Tonight I applied those mechanics in a context that was larger than usual. The principle is the same. Walsh looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Continue, she said. She continued. When she reached the opera house, When she described the stage and the prisoners and the sight of Voss in the working light, Park's fingers slowed for the first time. Reyes looked up from his notepad. She kept her voice at the same register and kept going. She described the catwalk, the corridor, the two men who had been at the stage's perimeter and weren't anymore. She described it without embellishment or softening, because embellishment and softening were both forms of lying, and she had decided, somewhere in the last several hours, that she was done with the version of invisibility that required lying about what she was. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The recorder light blinked its patient red. Walsh reached over and turned it off. "That's sufficient for the immediate account," she said. "We'll need you available for formal testimony at a later date. I'll have the parameters to you by tomorrow morning. You are not to discuss the content of what you've told us tonight with anyone outside this room, including Moretti, until we have the formal agreement in place." She paused. "Do you understand?" "Yes." "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" Serafina thought about the answer to this. Her apartment in Logan Square, 3rd floor, the one she'd spent 8 months choosing not to personalize because she'd spent too many years in places that weren't permanent to bother. A spare room with a bed and a coat she'd want very much at this moment, and no one who would ask where she'd been. "Yes," she said. "Reyes will take you." She stood up from the chair. Walsh stood at the same time, and there was a moment where they were both standing on the same side of the table with the recorder off and the formal structure of the debrief technically complete. And Walsh looked at her with the expression of someone who had something to say that existed outside the formal structure. "The drive," Walsh said. "What you did to get it out, you understand what it's going to do." "Yes." "Hargrove's unit has been running corruption into 2 federal districts for 4 years, Walsh said. "The material on that drive is going to open cases that have been buried. It's going to cost some people who believed they were untouchable a great deal." She paused. "It's also going to close cases against people who were framed." Serafina absorbed this. "How many?" "We won't know until we work through it," Walsh said. "But the number is not small." She thought about the weight of that, about the tunnel and the parking structure and the utility lighting and the drive held between her palm and the key card, about what a small object could carry. "Good," she said, and meant it in the way she meant very few things, completely, without reservation, with the clean certainty of someone who had just paid a significant price for something and believed the exchange was fair. Reyes drove her to Logan Square in a car that didn't smell like federal vehicles usually smelled in movies. It smelled like fast food and air freshener and the ordinary faint mustiness of a vehicle that got driven a lot. He didn't speak during the drive, which suited her. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the city go past and let herself be, for the first time since 647, something other than operational. Her body filed its comprehensive report. The shoulder was definite. Not structural damage, she assessed, but a deep bruise that was going to make itself known for the next week. Her feet were done. There was a cut on her right palm from the industrial rubber seam in the operations room floor. Not deep, not serious, but it had been bleeding slowly for the last 2 hours, and she hadn't had the moment to do anything about it. She was cold in the specific way of someone who had been cold for a long time and whose core temperature had begun to accommodate the cold rather than fight it, which was a signal she recognized. She put her hands between her thighs and looked at the passing city and breathed. Reyes stopped in front of her building without asking the address, which meant Walsh had it, which meant Walsh had researched her before the parking structure, which meant the call to the prepaid phone had been more than a one-directional contact. She processed this without alarm. It made sense. People in Walsh's position didn't take calls from unknown numbers in the middle of federal operations without verifying the source first. "Thank you," she said to Reyes. He nodded. "Someone will contact you tomorrow," he said. It was the first complete sentence he'd spoken directly to her, and it was entirely informational, which she appreciated. She got out of the car. She stood on the pavement in front of her building in the November cold, and the dress that had been through the evening and the borrowed tactical jacket she'd been given somewhere along the way that was too large and smelled like someone else's life. And she looked up at the building's 3rd floor where her window was dark. Then she took out the prepaid phone, the one Lucien had given her, with one number, and she looked at the call log. The number she'd called from the parking structure had connected for 40 seconds before Walsh arrived. Before that call, there was one outgoing call listed that she hadn't made. She looked at the timestamp. 4 minutes before she'd come through the sub-level door, while she'd been in the tunnel. Lucian had called Walsh himself before she reached the parking structure. He had told Walsh where to find her. He had given Walsh her name and described what she was carrying. He had, in effect, ensured the handoff before he knew whether she'd make it out of the tunnel, because ensuring the handoff was the thing that mattered, and the uncertainty about whether she'd make it was not something he'd allowed to be a factor. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the mechanics of it, the decision, made before the outcome was known, to treat the mission as a certainty and act accordingly. She'd seen him make those decisions all evening. She understood them as a strategy. This one was different because the thing he'd decided to treat as a certainty was her. She stood on the pavement a moment longer. Then she went inside. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it 14 hours ago. The spare, functional arrangement of someone who had learned not to accumulate things that would have to be left behind. She turned on the kitchen light. She ran cold water over her right hand and dried it and wrapped it with the first aid supplies she kept in the bathroom cabinet, working with the automatic efficiency of someone who had bandaged their own injuries before and found the process unremarkable. She sat on the edge of her bed and took off the dress shoes and set them side by side on the floor and looked at them. She thought about part 5, not in those words. She thought about morning, about Walsh's contact tomorrow, and the formal testimony parameters and whatever came after. She thought about Lucian Moretti standing in the hotel corridor saying, "I'm going to finish this evening, and then I'm going to handle this," in the voice of a man for whom finishing things and handling things were the same act, performed on a timeline of his own determination. She thought about whether Dante was in custody. She thought about whether Voss had gotten the principals out. She did not think about the man in the stairwell or the 2 men at the stage's perimeter or the specific mechanics of the moments that had been required, because thinking about those things was not going to happen tonight. Tonight she was going to file them in the place where necessary things that couldn't be processed immediately were filed, and she was going to sleep, and in the morning she would be a person who had choices to make about what came next. That was enough. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when her phone rang. Not the prepaid, her own phone, the number she'd had for 3 years, the number she gave to exactly 4 people. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, Chicago area code. She looked at it for 2 rings. Then she answered. "Voss confirmed the principles are clear," Lucy Yen said. He sounded like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had recently been through something that had rearranged the furniture of his interior life. "Santos is in federal custody. Walsh has the structural documents she needed to freeze Dante's assets before morning." She was quiet for a moment. "Dante?" "He's at the Opera House," Lucian said. She went very still. "He knew we'd go there," she said. "Yes," Lucian said. And in that single syllable was the full weight of a man who had understood this for the last several hours and had been building towards something she couldn't yet see. "He's been there the whole time," she said, "since he left the hotel at 10:15. "Yes. He wanted the confrontation on a stage of his own choosing," she said. Not a question. The architecture of it assembling in her mind the way she assembled floor plans from brief observation. "The Opera House. Not the hotel. The hotel was the mechanism. The Opera House is where it ends," Lucian said, "on his terms. In a building our father bought in 1987 and signed over to him specifically in his will, the one thing he left to Dante alone." A pause. "He chose it deliberately. He wants me to understand that." "What does he have there?" 8 men. 4 of the principals from the ball who didn't make Voss's extraction. He has them as leverage. Another pause. "And Voss." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Voss. He took him during the extraction. One of Dante's men had been planted in the second vehicle." His voice was completely flat. The flatness of a man who had used all of his allocated emotion and was now operating on reserves. "Voss is alive, that's confirmed. But Dante is in communication and he has a timeline." "How long?" 2 hours, Lucian said. "He wants me there, alone." She already knew what she was going to say. She had known it, she thought, since the moment she had answered the call. She thought about the bed she was sitting on, and the dress shoes on the floor, and the cold she hadn't entirely driven out of her core yet, and she knew the calculation she was going to make, and she knew it was not, by any rational metric, a good calculation, and she made it anyway. "Tell me where the opera house is," she said. A silence. The particular quality of a silence from a man who was processing an unexpected answer and not allowing himself to show what that answer cost him to hear. "You just came out of a federal handoff," he said. "You have Walsh's oversight and—" "Tell me where it is," she said. Another silence, shorter. He told her. She stood up from the bed. She looked at the dress shoes on the floor, and she looked at the borrowed tactical jacket on the chair, and she looked at the window where Chicago was still going about its November night outside, indifferent and enormous, full of people who were having ordinary evenings in warm-lit places, and she felt the specific gravity of a decision that had already been made, pulling her forward toward what came next. She picked up the jacket. She thought, "This is the last exit." She thought, "I know." She walked out of the apartment and down the stairs and into the street and pulled out her phone to find the address he'd given her, and the night came up around her like a tide, and she walked into— The opera house smelled like wet stone and old blood, and the particular smell of a building that had been closed too long. Dust that had settled into the velvet seating, cold that had worked its way into the plaster, the ghost of 10,000 performances embedded in the walls and going nowhere. Serafina moved through the east corridor with her back to the wall and the Sig Sauer she'd taken from a dead man in her right hand and the weight of the last 6 hours in every part of her body that wasn't actively doing something useful. Her shoulder hurt where she'd hit the doorframe in the sub-level tunnel. Her feet, in the dress shoes Clara had put on her 12 hours ago in a different life, had given up pretending. She was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore, something older and quieter and more sustainable. The fuel that kicks in when the adrenaline burns out and you still have distance to cover. Beside her, Lucien moved without sound. She'd learned in the last hour that he moved differently in operational space than he moved in rooms full of people. In the hotel, in the ballroom, there had been a kind of performance in his physicality. Controlled, deliberate, every movement calibrated for the impression it made. Here, in the dark, that was entirely gone. What was left was something more animal and more honest. He moved like a man who had grown up around violence and had never entirely left that room, no matter how many floors above it he'd built his life. They'd come in through the south access, a loading entrance that Lucien had known about, and Dante's people hadn't covered, which meant either Dante's intelligence on the building was incomplete or he'd wanted them to find a way in. She'd been thinking about which of those was more likely for the last 4 minutes and hadn't arrived at a conclusion she trusted. Ahead of them, the corridor opened into the backstage area, a wide, high-ceiling space where the opera house's technical infrastructure lived, catwalks and counterweights, and the massive mechanisms that had once moved sets across the stage. All of it dormant now, all of it casting shapes in the emergency lighting that Dante's people had running on a portable generator, the only light in the building which told her exactly where in the building Dante wanted people to be. The stage. From backstage, she could hear voices. Voss had gotten 7 of them out. 7 of the principals from the ball, extracted through the maintenance tunnel, and 2 alternating vehicles, and the particular logistical genius of a man who had been doing this kind of work for 20 years and had never once been thanked for it in public. Valentina Russo was among the 7. Roland Finch. 3 others whose names she'd caught during the extraction and filed away. 2 she didn't know. Santos had not made it to the extraction point. Santos had been on this west lobby floor when Voss's man found him. Alive. Which was more than she'd expected, but barely, and the way Voss had looked when he communicated this across the earpiece told her everything she needed to know about what Dante thought of loose ends. Santos had talked. Under whatever pressure Dante's people had applied in the 20 minutes he'd been alone with them, he had told them everything he knew, which included the tunnel exit point, which was why the first vehicle had been forced to reroute. It also meant Dante knew Lucien was coming. She had said this to Lucien in the vehicle, sitting close enough that she could speak at a volume no one else could hear. He had looked at the back of the seat in front of him for a moment and then said, "Yes, he'd want that. He wants the confrontation. He's always wanted the confrontation." Something in his voice that she'd heard before, that particular flatness that lived on the other side of emotion, not the absence of it, but the compression. Dante has spent 34 years in my shadow. He needs me to see him win. That's a liability, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She had the USB drive in her jacket pocket. The dress had been exchanged in the second vehicle for tactical clothing, dark, functional, borrowed from one of Voss's men and too large in the shoulders. The ledger pages were with Voss, already transmitted to the number on the prepaid phone, which had turned out to belong to a federal prosecutor 3 states away who had been building a parallel case against Dante's federal contacts for 8 months and had been waiting for exactly this kind of material. Dante didn't know about the prosecutor. That was the only card they had. The backstage area had 4 of Dante's men in it. She knew this because Lucian knew this. A count he'd arrived at through a method she hadn't asked about and he hadn't explained. The kind of operational knowledge that came from sources she was better off not specifying. They went around 2 of them using the catwalks, which was her suggestion and his agreement, and it had worked the way things work when they're physically unpleasant and logistically correct. Her shoulder, coming down from the second catwalk, had made a sound she didn't appreciate. The other 2 required a different approach. She didn't think about it before or during. She thought about it after, standing in the wing of the stage with her back to the curtain and her breathing elevated and her hands steady, and she understood that she was in the process of becoming someone she hadn't been at the beginning of the evening, and she couldn't yet tell if that was a loss or just a fact. Lucien touched her arm once, brief. She looked at him. He tilted his head toward the stage. She looked through the gap in the curtain. The stage of the Aldermere Opera House was enormous, built in the 1930s for full orchestral productions, with the scale of an era that believed in grandeur as a public good. The proscenium arch soared 40 feet. The stage floor was dark hardwood, original, scarred by decades of use. And across it, in the portable generator's harsh working light, were 12 people. 8 of them were Dante's men, positioned at the stage's perimeter with the systematic coverage of a professional operation. 4 of them were prisoners, sitting on chairs that had been pulled from somewhere, bound at the wrists, positioned center stage with the theatrical deliberateness of a man who understood staging. 2 she recognized from the ball. 1 was a man she didn't know. The 4th was Voss. Voss, who had not made the final extraction point. She hadn't known. The earpiece had gone silent 40 minutes ago, and she had filed it under unknown status and kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not available. But here he was, sitting with his wrists bound and his face in the condition of a man who had declined to cooperate and had been educated about that decision. And he was alive and conscious, and his eyes were moving across the stage in the careful way of a man who was still working, still cataloging, still in the fight by every means available to him. Dante Moretti was at the front of the stage. She had not seen him before tonight. She'd constructed a picture of him from context and inference and the photograph in the briefcase, and the real thing was both more and less than that picture. He was younger looking than she'd expected, 34 years old, which she knew, but with the quality of someone who had never been forced to carry weight in his face. Lucian was a decade older and looked it and had earned every year. Dante looked like a man who had lived inside someone else's consequences and had therefore not accumulated his own. He was lean, well-dressed even now, with Lucien's bone structure but something different in the eyes. Not cold, like Lucien's, but hot. The specific heat of someone running on resentment that had been cultivated so long it had become structural. He was on the phone. She caught the end of a sentence. Confirm the clean sweep before the morning. Yes. And then he lowered the phone and stood looking out at the empty house seats beyond the stage with the posture of a man savoring a view he'd waited a long time to see. She looked at Lucian. He was already looking at her. She held up 4 fingers, pointed to the stage left perimeter, then the right, then the 2 closest to the prisoners. He looked at each position and gave her the smallest nod, confirmation that his count matched hers. Then he looked at Voss, center stage, and something moved in his face. She touched his arm, the same brief touch he'd used on her. He looked back at her. She pointed to herself, then to the stage right position, the one closest to the prisoners. Then she pointed to him and gestured. The 2 at left, the 2 at the front. He looked at her for a moment that lasted too long. She raised her eyebrows. He moved. The next 4 minutes were the most precise and most brutal thing she had ever been inside. She came through the stage right curtain low and fast, and the first man at the perimeter didn't have time to raise his weapon before she was inside his reach, which was where she needed to be, because inside his reach, The weapon became a liability, not an asset, and she knew how to work in close quarters against larger opponents because she had learned it in a group home in Bridgeport at 15 when learning it was the alternative to something worse. She took him down and took his weapon and moved. The second man saw her. He saw her, and he was fast, and she was faster by a margin that was not comfortable but was sufficient. And she reached the prisoners while the sound of Lucien working the stage left side filled the opera house with noise that bounced off the walls and the proscenium arch and the 40 feet of empty air above in a way that made it sound like more than it was. She cut Voss's wrists free with the blade from the first man's kit. He looked at her. "There are 2 more at the front," she said. "I know," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had been counting the entire time. "And Dante." Voss took the secondary weapon she offered and stood up from the chair, and she could see him catalog his own condition, the ribs, the face, the way he favored his left side, and file it under operational limitation rather than reason to stop. "I'm familiar with Dante," he said. "Stay with the others." She looked at the remaining 2 prisoners. The men from the ball, hands still bound, looking at her with the bewildered intensity of people who were revising their understanding of what she was. "All 4 of you, stage right wing. There's an exit through backstage south." "There are 4 men in backstage south," one of the ball men said. "There were," she said, and moved. Dante had not run. She'd half expected it, the exit of a man who had designed the machine and had no intention of being inside it when it concluded. But he was still at the front of the stage when she came around the last curtain, and Lucien was 12 feet from him, and the 2 men who'd been at the front perimeter were no longer standing, which meant Lucien had covered the distance in the time it took her to get the prisoners clear. The 3 of them, Lucien, Dante, and the space between them. She stopped at the edge of the light and held her position and watched. Dante had a weapon. It was pointed at Lucien. Lucien had his weapon lowered, not holstered, lowered, held at his side, which was either a tactical decision or something else, and she couldn't tell which from where she stood. The brothers looked at each other across 12 feet of original hardwood flooring, and she understood, watching them, that this was a conversation that had been going on for 34 years and was only now happening out loud. "You were going to let the feds bury me," Lucien said. No preamble. The same flat register he'd used in the hotel corridor when he was keeping himself functional by main force. "I was going to let the feds bury what you built," Dante said. "That's different. You killed Carver." Carver was going to tell you about Miami, about the account structures. Dante's voice had an energy in it, not defensiveness, something more forward than that, the energy of a man finally saying things he has been composting for years. "I'd been managing that exposure for 6 months. I didn't have a choice." "You've been managing my destruction for 3 years, Lucien said. "You had a great many choices." "Every choice in this family has been made by you," Dante said. The heat in it then, clean and sudden, like something that has been held at pressure finally releasing. "For 20 years, Lucien, since the day our father put his hand on your shoulder and not mine and walked out of the room. Every territory, every call, every decision about who we are and what we do and who gets to matter in this organization." His voice didn't waver, but the weapon in his hand moved slightly, a micro-adjustment that she tracked with full attention. "I built the West Side operations from nothing. I tripled the revenue in 4 years. I handled things you didn't want to know about so you could keep your hands clean enough to shake senators' hands. And you treated me like a department head." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "I treated you like family," he said, "which in this life is not a lesser thing." "You treated me like a lesser thing," Dante said, "and you called it family." The opera house held the silence. The generator hummed its indifferent note. She was watching Dante's trigger finger. She was watching the specific quality of his posture, the way emotion and intent lived in the body before they lived in action. She had learned to read that quality in rooms where reading it was survival. She saw it shift. "Dante," she said. Both of them looked at her. She stepped into the light. She held her weapon at her side, mirroring Lucien's posture, because she understood instinctively that matching his posture was important here, that what was happening in this space required a particular kind of equilibrium, and she was part of it now, whether she'd chosen to be or not. "The federal prosecutor has the ledgers," she said. She kept her voice even. The account structures, the payment records, the 3 years of communication between you and Hargrove's task force, all of it transmitted 40 minutes ago. She watched his face process this. The case you built against Lucien is now the case being built against you, and against Hargrove, and against the 6 contractors whose names appear in the account records. Dante's face moved through several things. She tracked all of them. "You're bluffing," he said. "The prosecutor's name is Delaney Walsh," she said. 8th District. She's been building the corruption case against Hargrove's task force since before any of this started. She was waiting for documentation she couldn't manufacture herself. She held his gaze. "She has it now." Silence. "That's not possible," he said. "The only copy. The USB drive was copied in the vehicle before we came here," she said. "The physical ledger pages were photographed and transmitted. The copy in the Opera House management room, the backup you put there this afternoon, the one in the false bottom equipment case, was accessed by Voss's contact 90 minutes ago." She paused. "You planned very carefully for the things you could see coming, Dante. You didn't plan for me." The weapon in his hand was shaking. Not much. A small, involuntary tremor that she recognized as the body receiving news that the mind was refusing. "There's no version of tonight where you walk out of this differently than you walk out of this," she said. "That's done. It's already done." She took one step toward him. "The question is what happens in the next 60 seconds in this room." Dante looked at his brother. Lucien looked back at him. Something passed between them that she was watching but not part of. The specific transmission between two people who have a history so long it has its own weather, its own geography, its own language. She saw Lucien's face in it, and it was not what she expected. Not triumph. Not the cold resolution of a man who has cornered an enemy. Something rawer than that, and harder to look at directly. "Put it down," Lucien said. "Quiet." "Dante, put it down." "You'll hand me to Walsh," Dante said. "Yes." After everything, Lucien said. "Yes, that's what happens." He held his brother's eyes. "I'm not going to tell you it's fair. The position you were put in, the way our father ran this family, the way I perpetuated it without questioning it, none of that was fair. You're right about that." His voice didn't soften, but something in it opened, the way a fist opens. "And none of that is why I'm putting you in front of Walsh. I'm putting you in front of Walsh because of Carver, because of the 47 people in that hotel tonight who could have died, because of Santos, who did what he did out of fear and is lying in a hospital because you don't leave things behind that can talk." Dante's face was doing something difficult and private. "You made yourself into a monster to defeat one," Lucien said. "I know what that costs. I've been doing it my whole life." A pause. "Somewhere in there is the person I used to know. I'm talking to him." The weapon came down. Not fast. Slowly, with the specific weight of something that has been held up a long time. Dante lowered it to his side, and then he set it on the stage floor, and he stood up straight and looked at his brother, and in that look was something she turned away from slightly, because some grief is not meant to have witnesses. She took a breath. Lucien crossed the distance between them. He didn't touch his brother. He stopped in front of him and looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, something she couldn't hear, and Dante closed his eyes. Voss handled the logistics. He always handled the logistics, which she was beginning to understand was how empires actually ran. Not on the decisions of the man at the top, but on the relentless, unglamorous competence of the people below him who converted those decisions into reality. Dante was taken into custody by Walsh's people, who arrived 22 minutes after the stage cleared. Not federal, Walsh had been careful about which federal resources she used, given how thoroughly Hargrove's task force had been compromised. The men she brought were her own, vetted, and they moved through the opera house with the quiet efficiency of people who had a great deal of paperwork waiting for them and wanted to do the physical part correctly. Serafina sat on the stage's edge. She sat with her feet hanging over into the empty orchestra pit and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the empty house seats rising in their tiers in the working light, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time she'd had access to nothing in particular in the last several hours. Her shoulder had stiffened. Her feet were going to require a conversation with whoever was responsible for her shoes going forward, if there was a going forward, which was a question she hadn't addressed yet. She was aware of a general inventory of minor damage that she'd been deferring and would need to attend to. The physical accounting that bodies present when the emergency is over and they want their due. She heard him come up beside her. She had learned the sound of his footsteps in the last 6 hours well enough to recognize them without turning. Lucien sat down on the stage's edge beside her. They sat for a moment in the silence of the opera house, which was a different silence than any other silence she'd been in tonight. Not the absence of danger, but the actual presence of stillness, quiet, that was its own thing rather than just the gap between bad events. "Walsh will want to speak with you," he said. "I know. I can have representation there." "I don't need your representation," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He looked at her. "I didn't do anything tonight that I need representation for," she said. "I was brought to a hotel event by an employer. Things happened that were outside my control. I assisted in protecting people at significant personal risk." She paused. "Walsh built a case on the material I delivered. She's not going to make that difficult for me." "You're very clear-headed," he said. "I've had a lot of practice," she said, "at figuring out what comes next when everything before it has gone sideways." He was quiet for a moment. The generator hummed. Somewhere in the back of the building, Voss was directing things in his clipped, economical way. "Carver," he said. She waited. "He was loyal," Lucien said. "I want you to know that. Whatever Dante thought he knew about the Miami trip, Carver went to Miami to look into something he'd found in the account structures. He was investigating Dante." He paused. "He didn't tell me because he didn't have anything confirmed yet. He was protecting me from an accusation he couldn't prove." He looked at the empty seats. "He died doing his job. The job I didn't know he was doing." She understood what this cost to say. She didn't diminish it by responding immediately. She let it exist in the air of the opera house, where it deserved to exist. And then she said, "He knew who he worked for." "Yes. People who know who they work for and choose to protect them anyway. That's not nothing." "No," Lucien said. "It's not." Another silence. She could feel the warmth of him beside her, the physical proximity of a person she'd spent the last several hours in close operational contact with, and the strangeness of that, the intimacy that crisis manufactured without asking permission. "What happens now?" she said. "To the organization." He took a breath. "Walsh is going to want cooperation on Hargrove and the task force corruption. I'm going to give it to her." He said it with the directness of a man who had made the decision before this moment, but was saying it aloud for the first time. "That has a price. She'll know what it is. We'll negotiate it." A pause. "There are parts of what my family has built that I'm going to dismantle. Not because Walsh asks for it, because they should be dismantled." She looked at him. "I have been running an organization built on a foundation I didn't choose and never adequately questioned," he said. "I told myself the violence was controlled, the damage was managed, that I was better than the alternative." He met her eyes. "Tonight was the cost of that accounting. 47 people in a hotel, Carver, Santos in a hospital, Dante in custody." He looked away. "There's a version of what I do that doesn't require that accounting. I should have built it 10 years ago." "Why didn't you?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because building it required trusting people," he said. "And I had been given, across a great many years, substantial evidence that trusting people was a mechanism for getting them killed." She understood this in a way that required no translation. "That's not a good enough reason anymore," he said. "If it ever was." That Walsh was a compact woman in her mid-40s with the kind of face that had started out pretty and been improved by 20 years of work that required seeing things clearly. She arrived with 4 people, spoke with Lucien for 40 minutes in the opera house's front office while Serafina waited in the corridor, and then came out and looked at Serafina with the careful attention of someone deciding how to approach an unusual data point. "You're the one who made the call," Walsh said. "Yes." "And delivered the material." "Yes." Walsh looked at her for a moment. "You're a housekeeper." "I was," Serafina said. "I'm not sure what I am now." Something in Walsh's expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a specific kind of person. "I'm going to need a full account of everything you observed tonight, starting from when you entered the Moretti Grand Hotel." "I know," Serafina said. "I have a good memory." I'll need it in writing. I went to school on a scholarship, Serafina said. I can write. Walsh almost smiled. All right, she said. Let's sit down. Shite. The debrief took 3 hours. She gave it without editorializing, without protecting anyone beyond the bounds of what she could defend, and without minimizing what she'd witnessed or participated in. Walsh's people took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions, and she answered them with the same precision she'd brought to everything else tonight. At the end, Walsh closed the folder she'd been writing in and looked at Serafina across the Opera House's administration table and said, "You understand this makes you a material witness? Yes. That has implications for your safety going forward. I understand. We can arrange—" "I'm not going into any kind of protective arrangement," Serafina said. "I've spent my whole life in arrangements other people made for me. I'm done with that." Walsh studied her. That's a significant statement to make given the circumstances. "I'm aware," Serafina said. "I've thought about it for the last 3 hours." Walsh looked at her folder. Then she looked back up. "You made a decision tonight that broke a federal case open that my office has been building for 8 months, she said. You did it without legal counsel, without any institutional protection, and without any apparent training in any of the things you successfully did." She paused. Why? Serafina thought about this. She thought about the answer that was truest, which was not the most comfortable answer, which was also the only answer she was willing to give to a woman who had spent 20 years requiring things to be true. "Because I was there," she said, "and I could. And there were 47 people in a building who were going to die if no one did anything." She looked at Walsh. "You don't have to have a grand reason. Sometimes you just have to be the person who is standing in the right place and decides not to walk away." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than I usually get," she said. "I'm told I'm careful," Serafina said. "Careful and honest aren't always the same thing, but tonight they happen to line up." She found Lucien outside. The Opera House's side exit led out onto a narrow street that in the pre-dawn was empty and cold and wet from rain that had finally, in the last hour, moved on to somewhere else. The pavement was dark and reflective, and the streetlight overhead was doing the particular thing streetlights did in the aftermath of rain, throwing light off surfaces that had been matte before, making the ordinary world briefly strange. He was standing on the pavement with his hands in his pockets. He'd lost his jacket somewhere in the last several hours and was in his shirt, collar still open, looking at the street with the expression of a man who was standing inside the first quiet moment of a new situation and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She came to stand beside him. They stood for a moment without speaking. "Walsh?" he said. "Done," she said. And I'm a material witness," she said, "and your name is attached to a cooperation agreement that she was very careful to describe as ongoing. And Dante will be in federal custody by morning." She paused. "And Hargrove is going to have a very bad few months." He nodded. "What she asked you for," Serafina said. "The cooperation. The task force corruption files. 3 years of documentation on how Hargrove's unit was being managed." He paused. "And my testimony on 2 outstanding cases that have nothing to do with me personally, but that I have knowledge of." "That's significant." "Yes." "Is it—" she started. "It's the right thing," he said, flatly, not defensively. "That's the only question I'm interested in at this point." She looked at the street. A cab went by at the far end, moving slowly, the only vehicle in the pre-dawn grid. Somewhere several blocks over, the city was waking up into a day that would be, for most of the people in it, entirely ordinary. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "Tonight?" "What you did," he said. "In the tunnel, the hotel, the opera house." He was looking at the street, not at her. "You didn't have to do any of it. At every point where the rational calculation was to take the exit, you didn't take it." "There wasn't always an exit," she said. "There was at the beginning," he said. "The tunnel was an exit. I gave you a key card and a phone and told you to leave. You could have gone." He turned to look at her. "Why didn't you?" She thought about this. It deserved an honest answer, and she had told Walsh, apparently committed to honesty tonight. "Because you were going back into the building," she said, "and someone should have gone with you." He looked at her for a moment. "That's not an adequate explanation." "No," she agreed, "it's not." Then what is? She thought about what she was willing to say, about the line between honest and exposed, which was a line she'd maintained carefully for most of her adult life, about the fact that maintaining it had served her well and had also left her, until approximately 14 hours ago, entirely alone in every way that mattered. I have spent a long time, she said slowly, being in rooms where things were happening and telling myself that my job was to keep my head down and not become involved, that the smart move was always to make myself small and invisible and wait for the danger to pass. She looked at the streetlight reflection in the wet pavement. I was very good at it. It kept me safe. It also meant that at the end of every day, I had done nothing that mattered to anyone, including myself. She paused. Tonight I made a different choice, and people are alive because of it, including you. She looked at him. I think I would rather be the kind of person who makes that choice, even at the cost, even if it's harder. He held her gaze. In the pre-dawn light, his face was tired in the way faces were tired when they'd dropped everything that wasn't essential and were just the face of a person, nothing else over it. I want to offer you something, he said. Not employment, not any arrangement that replicates what tonight replaced. He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who understood their weight. I have a foundation, legitimate. It funds 3 programs for youth coming out of the foster system in Illinois. He held her gaze. It has been run by a board that I selected and haven't adequately engaged with. It needs someone who understands what those programs are actually supposed to do, who understands it from the inside. Another pause. The position is real. The salary is real. And it has nothing to do with anything that happened tonight, except that tonight is how I know you exist. She was quiet. You don't have to answer now, he said. I know, she said. The city was lightening. Not much. A quality change at the horizon rather than anything visible overhead. The first suggestion that the darkness had a direction it was moving in. She had been awake for 22 hours and her body was beginning to present the invoice for that, in terms that couldn't be deferred much longer. She thought about the foundation, about youth coming out of the foster system, about the 12 different houses between 6 and 17, and the specific knowledge she carried from that experience that no briefing document and no well-meaning board member could replicate. About what it might mean to put that knowledge to work. She thought about Lucien Moretti standing on a wet pavement in the pre-dawn, offering her something that had no manipulation in it. She could hear the absence of manipulation, the way you heard the absence of a sound you'd been straining to detect. He was tired and diminished and honest in the way that people were honest after they'd been stripped of everything they'd been using to manage their presentation. And what was left was this: a man who had run an empire on fear and was standing in the rubble of the night that had finally cost him enough to make him stop. The foundation, she said. What's it called? The Carver Initiative, he said. And then, after a beat, it wasn't named for Marco. It was named for the word. I named it 4 years ago. I intend to keep the name. She nodded slowly. Something settled in her chest that she didn't try to name. I'll think about it, she said. That's enough, he said. They stood on the pavement in the early morning cold. The city continued its slow ignition around them. A few blocks south, a bakery would be opening, and somewhere the first commuters were running the first trains, and the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know what had happened in its opera house last night was beginning to turn. Serafina Vale stood in the middle of it and felt the specific sensation of a life that had just changed directions without asking permission, and understood that she was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, not afraid of what came next. Not certain, not safe, exactly. The world she was standing in was not a safe world, and she didn't expect it to become one, but not afraid. Lucien turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and in the particular quality of that early morning light, the light that belonged to the hour between what had been and what was coming. 2 people who had survived the same night stood on the same piece of wet pavement and didn't look away from each other. No promises. No architecture of a future that hadn't been built yet. Just the knowledge, shared and unspoken, that they were both still standing, which was, for now, enough. The city woke up around them, indifferent and enormous and full of people who would never know their names, and the night that had tried to swallow them whole receded into the past where nights went, and the light came.